I never planned to tell this story. Not because I forgot it, because forgetting was never an option, but because time has a strange way of convincing you that surviving something is the same as escaping it. For years, I told myself that I had lived through it, that it belonged to a version of me who no longer existed, a younger woman with steadier hands and fewer regrets. I told myself the past had stayed where it belonged. But last winter, standing in a hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and old paint, I saw his name printed neatly on a medical form, and the world tilted just enough for me to understand the truth. The past doesn't disappear. It doesn't forgive. It waits, quietly, patiently, as if it knows you will eventually come back. There are two families in this world who believe they understand where they come from. There is one man who believes he knows who his mother is, who looks into a familiar face and sees himself reflected there, who carries a last name like a birthright and wears it without question. And then there is me standing between what they believe and what actually happened, carrying a knowledge that never belonged to me, but never let me go either. I let them raise the wrong child. Even now, saying it feels too deliberate, too cruel, as though it suggests intention. I tell myself it doesn't mean what it sounds like. I tell myself it was confusion, exhaustion, poor lighting, an understaffed maternity ward gasping for air on a night that refused to slow down. I tell myself no one lets something like that happen on purpose. But every time I replay the story in my head, it ends the same way, with a moment where I could have spoken and didn't. A moment so small it barely registered at the time, but heavy enough to crack everything that came after. My name is Evelyn Moore. I am 58 years old, and the lie I am about to tell you about is older than most of the scars on my hands, older than the lines that frame my mouth, older than the excuses I have been feeding myself for decades. Back then, I wore pale blue scrubs that never quite fit right at the shoulders. They were always a little too stiff when freshly washed, a little too loose after a long shift, and no matter how many times I replaced them, they carried the faint smell of disinfectant that never fully came out. My shoes were practical and ugly, chosen for comfort rather than appearance, the kind that squeaked against the polished hospital floor with every step I took. I kept my hair pulled back too tight because loose strands had a habit of falling into places they didn't belong, and I had learned early on that neatness was mistaken for competence. That night, when I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of a supply cabinet, my face looked older than it should have, drawn, sharp, eyes rimmed red from a double shift I hadn't been scheduled for but agreed to cover anyway. I told myself I could handle it. I always did. The maternity ward was full, not busy, overflowing. The kind of night where call buttons flashed nonstop and voices layered over one another until nothing sounded clear anymore. 2 deliveries arrived minutes apart. 2 women gripping bed rails, faces slick with sweat, voices raw from pain and fear. 2 fathers pacing hallways with their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles went white, whispering prayers they hadn't practiced in years. Charts were stacked in uneven piles. Tags were moved, then moved again. Instructions were shouted, then corrected, then contradicted. The air felt thick, as if even breathing required permission. Somewhere between the noise and the urgency, something slipped. I remember holding one baby first, small, quiet, eyes already open as if they were watching the world cautiously, taking it in before deciding whether it was safe. The second baby came moments later, louder, stronger lungs announcing their arrival with outrage, fists clenched as if offended by the brightness of the room. They were wrapped quickly, tagged quickly, and moved quickly, handed from one set of arms to another in a practiced rhythm that left no room for hesitation. Except I hesitated. I noticed it because of a bracelet. It was loose, too loose for a newborn wrist. The plastic band slid just enough to make my stomach tighten before my mind caught up. I remember thinking that even before I let myself understand why it bothered me. I remember adjusting it, my fingers lingering a second longer than necessary. I remember the weight of that second, the way it stretched as if daring me to name the feeling rising in my chest. And then I remember pushing it aside. This will sort itself out, I told myself. That is what people like me say when we sense disaster, but aren't ready to admit it yet. It is the sentence you cling to when the truth feels too large to carry and too dangerous to set down. The supervisor on duty stood near the doorway, arms folded, posture rigid, her face tight with the kind of stress that doesn't invite discussion. It demands results. She trusted me. I had been there longer than most of the nurses on that floor. I was reliable. When I spoke, people listened. When I opened my mouth, I almost told her. I almost said something is wrong. We need to slow down. We need to double check. The words hovered at the back of my throat, pressing forward, asking to be released. But then she glanced at the clock mounted above the nurse's station. And then one of the mothers started hemorrhaging. And then the hallway filled again with the sound of hurried footsteps and raised voices. Urgency swallowed caution. Fear swallowed honesty. So I stayed quiet. That was the first lie. It wasn't spoken, wasn't written down, wasn't even acknowledged as a lie at the time. It was simply chosen. And choices, once made, have a way of repeating themselves. Days passed, then weeks, then months. I told myself that if something had truly gone wrong, someone else would notice. I told myself hospitals had systems for these things, checks and balances designed to catch human error before it hardened into fate. I told myself my silence was temporary, that I would speak up once things calmed down, once the moment felt right. Years passed. I watched from a distance as both families moved forward, unaware they were carrying each other's futures in their arms. I saw birthday photographs posted online, candles glowing on cakes while children smiled without knowing why a stranger sometimes paused too long on their pictures. I saw school uniforms pressed neatly, backpacks slung over shoulders, missing teeth grinned through proudly. I saw graduation caps tossed into the air, futures celebrated with speeches about destiny and hard work. I learned their names without meaning to. Learned which child gravitated toward music, which preferred silence, which one had a laugh that filled a room, which one listened more than they spoke. I told myself they were happy, and that happiness mattered more than accuracy. But guilt doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't knock. It seeps. It showed up in the way I avoided certain streets, certain neighborhoods where I knew I might run into them. It lived in the way I lingered too long over medical forms, triple-checking details that didn't belong to me. It trembled in my hands every time I heard the word genetics spoken casually, as though it were just another topic, harmless and theoretical. I volunteered for fewer shifts. I attended fewer reunions. I stopped answering questions that might lead to others. I told myself distance was maturity, not fear. The secret didn't stay still. It grew teeth as time passed. School records didn't align the way they should have. Blood types raised polite eyebrows. Doctors asked questions that were brushed aside with nervous laughter and reassurances that families came in all kinds of combinations now. The questions surfaced gently at first, like polite knocks on a door no one wanted opened. And every time I felt the past tug at my sleeve, reminding me that it was still there, still unfinished, I pulled away and whispered the same excuse. It's too late now. Until the night it wasn't. A medical emergency dragged the truth out of hiding. Blood tests were ordered. Charts were reopened. Old files were pulled from storage, yellowed at the edges, carrying names that hadn't been spoken together in decades. And then my phone rang, lighting up with a number I hadn't seen since I still believed silence could protect people. They wanted me to confirm what I remembered. Standing there, listening to my own heartbeat fill the space between questions, I finally understood something I wish I had known earlier. Silence doesn't erase damage. It doesn't preserve peace. It only delays the moment when everything arrives at once, unmanageable and unforgiving. I am not telling you how this ends. Not yet. Because this story is not just about what happened in that hospital on a night ruled by chaos and exhaustion. It is about what happens after the truth finally decides it has waited long enough. If you want to see how this unfolds, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The night deepened the way it only does inside a hospital, without windows, without mercy, without any real sense of time. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in the same pale, unforgiving glow that flattened faces and made exhaustion look permanent. My feet ached in a dull, steady way that had stopped registering as pain hours earlier, replaced by a numb awareness that I had been standing for too long and would keep standing anyway. The board at the nurse's station was already full when another name was added, then another, written quickly, wiped, rewritten. Someone cursed softly under their breath. Someone else laughed, sharp and brittle, the sound people make when they're too tired to be afraid anymore. I had been on my feet since before sunset. A double shift that wasn't supposed to be mine, taken because there was no one else and because saying no had never come easily to me. My body moved on muscle memory alone, hands doing what they had been trained to do even as my mind lagged behind, heavy and slow. The maternity ward was stretched thin, the kind of thin that doesn't tear immediately, but promises it will if pulled any further. Every room was occupied. Every bed held a woman breathing through pain, eyes searching the ceiling for something solid to hold on to. The air smelled like antiseptic layered over sweat and fear. 2 labor calls came in almost on top of each other. One from a young woman whose chart I barely had time to skim before being pulled away again. The other from a mother who had labored too long already, her body showing signs of strain we all pretended not to notice yet. Voices overlapped. Orders were given, repeated, questioned. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor alarmed and was silenced too quickly, as if acknowledging it would invite trouble. I remember thinking that the night felt off, like a storm gathering without thunder. The supervisor stood near the center of it all, arms folded, jaw clenched, eyes darting from room to room. She was good at her job, efficient, commanding, but she was under pressure from above and we all knew it. Too many patients, not enough staff, and administrators who wanted numbers to stay clean no matter the cost. She trusted me. That trust sat heavy on my shoulders, a weight I didn't know how to set down. The first baby arrived just after midnight. Small, quiet, the kind of newborn who didn't announce themselves so much as appear. I held him briefly, feeling the surprising warmth of his skin through the thin blanket, noticing the way his eyes fluttered open and then shut again as if the world was already too much. There was no time to linger. I checked him quickly, routine movements performed without thought, then passed him along to be cleaned and tagged. Minutes later, the second baby arrived in a rush of sound and motion. This one screamed the moment air hit his lungs, a raw, furious cry that cut through the haze of the room. Strong grip, tight fists, face flushed with effort and indignation. He felt heavier in my arms, solid in a way that made me think he would be stubborn, that he would fight the world rather than observe it. Someone laughed nervously at the noise. Someone else told the mother to breathe, to rest, that it was over now. Everything happened too fast after that. Wrapping, tagging, movement. Babies passed from one set of hands to another while charts were updated and doors opened and closed. The supervisor's voice carried over it all, sharp and insistent, reminding us of protocols even as the night refused to follow them neatly. I moved as I was told, responding to names and gestures, my mind a step behind my body. It was the bracelet that slowed me. Plastic against skin, white with black lettering, meant to be temporary, but trusted as permanent truth. It slid when it shouldn't have, just a fraction, enough for me to feel it before I fully saw it. My fingers tightened instinctively, adjusting it back into place. The name printed there blurred for a moment as my vision swam, exhaustion and something else mixing in my chest. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself newborn risks were small, that things shifted, that I was overthinking because I was tired. Still, a cold thread of awareness slipped through me. I looked from the bracelet to the baby's face, searching for something I couldn't name. There was no obvious sign, no dramatic difference, no moment of clarity that demanded action. Just a quiet wrongness that settled into my gut, unwelcome and insistent. I glanced toward the other bassinet, toward the other baby now being settled, his cries fading into hiccups. For a second, only a second, I imagined switching them back, retracing steps, fixing whatever my body was already trying to warn me about. Then the supervisor called my name. Her eyes flicked to the clock. Someone shouted for help down the hall. A nurse rushed past me, nearly colliding with my shoulder. The world surged forward again, relentless. I swallowed the thought before it could fully form. This will sort itself out, I told myself. Hospitals have systems. Someone else will catch it. If it were truly wrong, it would be obvious. I let go. The rest of the night blurred together in fragments. A mother crying softly once the adrenaline wore off. A father pressing his forehead to a glass window, smiling like his face might split. Paperwork piling up, signatures scrawled hastily, hands passing pens back and forth. I moved through it all with a strange detachment, as if part of me had stepped back and was watching the rest go through the motions. When the sun finally rose, filtering weakly through a narrow window at the end of the corridor, I felt hollowed out. My shift ended, but I stayed longer, tidying things that didn't need tidying, checking charts that had already been checked. I lingered near the nursery longer than necessary, eyes drawn again and again to two bassinets positioned too close together. Nothing looked wrong. Everything looked exactly as it should. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the unease settle deeper. Days passed. No alarm sounded. No frantic calls came from administration. Life in the ward moved on, carrying new emergencies, new births, new mistakes layered over old ones. I waited for the moment when someone would tap my shoulder and say, "We need to talk." I waited for the correction that would prove my fear unfounded. It never came. The realization arrived quietly, without ceremony. It came one afternoon when I was restocking supplies, my hands moving automatically as my mind drifted. I thought of the bracelet again, of the way it had slid too easily, of the second I had paused. I thought of the names on the charts, of the way they had been read aloud, confirmed, then hurried along. The image sharpened suddenly, details clicking into place with a clarity that stole my breath. I stopped what I was doing, box slipping from my hands and hitting the floor with a dull thud. I didn't bend to pick it up right away. I stood there, staring at nothing, as the truth finally found its shape. It hadn't sorted itself out. No one else had caught it. The systems I had trusted had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had moved forward without question, assuming that the people inside them were infallible. I leaned against the supply cart, my heart pounding hard enough to make my ears ring. My mouth felt dry, my thoughts racing now that they had been unleashed. I replayed the night again, slower this time, without the buffer of denial. The order of events, the timing, the hands, the bracelets. There was no dramatic proof, no document I could point to and say, "Here, this is where it went wrong." There was only certainty, heavy and undeniable. I knew. The knowledge didn't come with relief. It came with terror, because knowing meant responsibility, and responsibility meant action. And action meant tearing something open that everyone else believed was already sealed. I had a chance then, early enough that the damage would be contained, that explanations could be made, that lives hadn't yet grown around the lie. I stood there for a long time, weighing the cost of speaking against the cost of staying silent, my flaw already whispering to me in a familiar voice. If you say something now, you will be the villain. If you stay quiet, no one gets hurt. Not yet. By the time I picked up the box from the floor, the decision had already been made. And the night of the birth slipped quietly into history, carrying the truth with it, waiting for the day it would demand to be remembered. The first real chance to speak came sooner than I expected and later than it should have. It arrived dressed as something ordinary, something so routine that ignoring it felt almost natural. A follow-up review. A quiet request from administration to walk through the events of that night. Not because anything was suspected, but because paperwork demanded completion and loose ends offended the system. I remember being surprised by how calm I felt when I was called in, how my pulse didn't race the way I imagined it would. Fear, it turns out, can be very patient. It doesn't always announce itself with shaking hands or shallow breath. Sometimes it settles in and waits for instructions. I sat in a small office that smelled faintly of stale coffee and copier toner. My back straight, my hands folded in my lap the way I had been taught to do in situations that required seriousness. A file lay open on the desk between us. Names, times, signatures. The supervisor skimmed through it quickly, tapping a pen against the paper, her attention divided between me and the ticking clock on the wall. She asked me to confirm the sequence of events, the kind of question designed to be answered without thought. Who was present? Who assisted? Which baby was delivered first? Which second? Her tone carried no suspicion, only efficiency. I answered smoothly. Too smoothly. My voice didn't catch. My eyes didn't dart. I told her exactly what the chart already said, because the chart had been written by hands like mine, by people who trusted the process enough not to question it. With every word, I felt the truth press harder against the inside of my chest, like something alive and desperate for air. I waited for a pause, a space where I could step in and say there might have been a mistake, that we should double check, that something about that night hadn't sat right with me. The pause never came. When she looked up at me and nodded, satisfied, something inside me went still. It was a subtle shift, quiet and final. That was the moment the lie solidified. Not because I said something untrue, but because I allowed an untruth to stand unchallenged. Silence can be just as deliberate as speech. It can carry just as much weight. I left the office with a strange sense of relief that made me ashamed of myself almost immediately. Nothing had changed. No alarms had been raised. The world had kept its shape. For a brief, dangerous moment, I believed that maybe this was how it would remain. That the truth could be absorbed, diluted by time until it no longer mattered. That my fear had been unnecessary. That belief didn't last long. Watching the children grow became unavoidable. Even when I told myself I wasn't looking, some part of me always was. It began with small things, updates passed along casually by colleagues who didn't know what they were saying to me. A photo taped to a locker door. A proud mention of a first smile, a first step. I nodded along, smiled when expected, trained myself to react the way a normal person would. Inside, I cataloged everything. I noticed differences no one else would have thought to question. A familiar shape to the eyes, a certain tilt of the head, mannerisms that echoed people who had no idea they were being mirrored. I told myself it was coincidence. People see patterns where they want them. But the longer I watched, the harder it became to dismiss the quiet connections threading themselves through my observations. Years passed, measured not in dates, but in milestones. The first day of school, the awkward stages in between, the way one child gravitated toward books while the other preferred noise and movement. I learned their rhythms without intending to, their personalities unfolding like stories I couldn't stop reading. I learned which parents worried too much and which worried too little. I learned who praised loudly and who showed love in quieter ways. The guilt didn't arrive as a sudden collapse. It settled slowly, like dust accumulating on surfaces you swear you clean regularly. It lived in the way I lingered when I saw them, then left abruptly before conversation could deepen. It showed up in the extra care I took with unrelated patients, as if kindness elsewhere could offset what I had withheld here. I volunteered for holiday shifts I didn't need. I donated to school fundraisers anonymously. I convinced myself that these small gestures counted for something. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined what it would be like to tell the truth then, when the children were still young enough to adapt, when identities were still forming. I rehearsed conversations that ended with understanding, with forgiveness, with gratitude, even. Those rehearsals always fell apart the moment I pictured the actual faces involved, the confusion, the hurt, the irreversible fracture. Fear would step in, calm and persuasive, reminding me that love had already taken root where it shouldn't have, that pulling it out now would only leave scars. So I stayed quiet. The secret grew heavier as the children grew older, because it grew alongside them. Every achievement layered meaning onto the lie. Every family tradition strengthened it. The truth didn't fade with time. It became more detailed, more vivid, more painful to imagine disrupting. By the time I realized that silence wasn't protecting anyone so much as protecting me, it had already become my default response. Guilt, I learned, doesn't need to scream to be unbearable. Sometimes it just sits with you, watching as life unfolds exactly as it shouldn't and exactly as you allowed it to. The lie did not stay abstract. It did not remain a distant, theoretical wrong that lived only in my thoughts. Over time, it took on weight and shape, settling into my routines until it felt inseparable from the rest of my life. I told myself I was merely a witness, someone who had observed a mistake and survived the knowledge of it. But the truth was less comfortable. I was invested. The longer I stayed silent, the more I became attached not just to the families, but to the version of the world that my silence allowed to exist. I learned to protect the lie the way people protect fragile things, with careful handling and unspoken rules. I avoided conversations that drifted too close to biology or lineage. When someone joked about how much a child looked like their parents, I smiled and nodded, my stomach tightening even as my face remained composed. I trained myself to hear statements like blood will tell and family traits run deep without flinching. Each time I succeeded, it felt like proof that I was managing it, that I was strong enough to carry what others could not. Rationalizing silence became easier with practice. I told myself that love mattered more than genetics, that bonds built over years could not be undone by paperwork and blood tests. I told myself that children deserve stability, not upheaval, and that parents deserve the families they had fought to build. When doubt crept in, I reminded myself that I had not created the mistake. I had only failed to correct it. That distinction mattered to me, even if it meant nothing in the end. There were moments when the lie felt almost noble. Watching the family celebrate together, seeing genuine joy in ordinary moments, I convinced myself that exposing the truth would be an act of cruelty rather than justice. I imagined myself as a guardian of peace, someone absorbing the cost so others would not have to. It was a comforting story, and like all comforting stories, it asked very little of me except continued silence. The attachment deepened in ways I didn't anticipate. I felt a quiet pride when the children succeeded, a private sense of relief when they were healthy, as though their well-being validated my choices. I caught myself worrying about them during storms or illnesses, my concern sharpened by the knowledge that I had shaped their paths in ways they would never understand. The lie had woven itself into my emotional life, threading through moments of care and fear until it felt less like an intrusion and more like a responsibility. But lies, no matter how carefully tended, leave traces. The warning signs began as subtle inconsistencies, the kind that could be dismissed easily if you weren't looking too closely. A comment from a pediatrician about blood type that was brushed aside with a laugh. A form returned for clarification because something didn't quite match. Each incident landed like a soft knock, polite and easily ignored, but persistent enough to unsettle me. I noticed how my heart rate spiked whenever medical records were mentioned in passing. I began to read articles I had no reason to read, searching for explanations that might justify what I already knew couldn't be justified. I told myself that families are complicated now, that genetics isn't destiny, that anomalies happen. I repeated these lines until they sounded almost convincing. Then the questions became more direct. A doctor asked about family medical history during a routine appointment, his tone casual but thorough. He scribbled notes, paused, and asked for clarification. I watched the exchange from across the room, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my mind racing ahead to outcomes I couldn't control. The answer he received seemed to satisfy him for the moment, but I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes before he moved on. Records were revisited. Old files were requested and reviewed with a care that felt ominous to me, though no one else seemed concerned. I found excuses to be nearby when conversations happened, close enough to listen without appearing interested. Each time, I walked away telling myself that nothing had come of it, that the system was still asleep. At night, I lay awake replaying these moments, imagining how easily they could unravel everything. The lie felt less like a shield now, and more like a fragile structure held together by habit and hope. I understood, with a clarity that made my chest ache, that I could not control how long it would last. All I could do was decide how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice to keep it standing. By the time the questions grew sharper and the records more insistent, I had stopped pretending that silence was neutral. It was an active choice, one that required constant vigilance. And with every new warning sign, the cost of that choice became harder to ignore. The past did not announce its return with drama. It arrived the way it always had, quietly, through a door left half open, carried in by someone who had no idea what they were holding. I was older by then, slower in ways I pretended not to notice, my routines narrower, my world carefully arranged to avoid certain intersections. I believed I had learned how to live around the lie, how to keep it contained. That belief shattered the day I heard my name spoken by someone who had no reason to know it. It happened in a corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old paper. I was there on an errand I could not have explained afterward, one of those unnecessary trips we invent for ourselves when we want to feel useful. I had just turned the corner when I heard it, Evelyn Moore, spoken hesitantly, as if the person saying it was testing whether it belonged to me. I stopped before I could think better of it. When I turned, I saw a face that pulled me backward in time with alarming force. Older now, lined in places that hadn't been there before, but unmistakable. It was the supervisor. She smiled when she saw recognition cross my face, relief softening her posture. We exchanged pleasantries that felt too light for the weight pressing against my chest. She told me she was consulting part-time now, that she'd been brought in to review some older cases for quality assurance. Routine stuff, she said. Catching discrepancies. Cleaning up archives. Her words slid into place like pieces of a puzzle I had hoped would never be assembled. She mentioned the year, the ward, the night. I felt my body react before my mind did. A tightening in my shoulders, a hollow sensation just beneath my ribs. I told myself to stay calm, to listen more than I spoke. She said they were revisiting a handful of cases flagged by newer software. Nothing dramatic, just patterns the system hadn't been able to see before. She laughed softly and said it was strange how the past could resurface when you least expected it. I laughed too. That was when I knew how close we were to the edge. Not because she accused me of anything, she didn't, but because she didn't need to. The questions that followed were casual, almost friendly. Did you remember that night? Wasn't it overwhelming? So many births back to back. I answered carefully, choosing words that revealed nothing while sounding cooperative. I told her what I had told myself for years, that it had been chaotic, exhausting, blurred by urgency. She nodded, thoughtful, and said they might reach out again if they needed clarification. When she walked away, I stood there longer than necessary, my heart hammering as though I had run a long distance. Someone almost found out that day, not because the truth was spoken, but because it hovered so close to the surface that even the slightest pressure might have broken it through. After that, I lived differently. Every phone call startled me. Every official envelope set my pulse racing. I replayed our conversation endlessly, searching for hints I might have missed, signs that suspicion had already taken root. I considered, for the first time in a long while, what it would mean to confess preemptively, to take control of the narrative before it was taken from me. Each time I reached that point, fear stepped in, calm and persuasive as ever, reminding me of everything that would be lost. Then the emergency happened. It began, like so many things do, with a call in the middle of the night. A number I didn't recognize. A voice tight with urgency on the other end, asking if I was who they thought I was, if I could confirm my involvement in a case from years ago. I sat on the edge of my bed, the room dark around me, listening as the situation unfolded piece by piece. There had been an accident, a sudden collapse. Tests ordered quickly, then repeated because the results didn't make sense. Blood work that contradicted expectations. A doctor who trusted science more than stories and refused to let inconsistencies be explained away. They needed background. They needed context. They needed me. In the hospital, the air felt different than it had all those years ago, sharper, more precise, humming with machines that did not care about my excuses or intentions. I watched from the side as professionals moved efficiently, drawing blood, scanning screens, exchanging looks that carried more meaning than words. I recognized that look. It was the look of something not adding up. Science does not negotiate. It does not bend for comfort or sentiment. It lays out facts cleanly and waits for humans to catch up. The results came back, then came back again. Each time, the same conclusion. Genetic markers that refused to align with the story everyone had believed for decades. Family histories that unraveled under scrutiny. The room grew quieter as understanding spread, the kind of quiet that signals an irreversible shift. Someone asked, carefully, if adoption had ever been discussed. Someone else asked about records from the birth. That was when denial finally lost its footing. I felt something inside me give way, a support I hadn't realized I was leaning on until it collapsed. The truth, which I had carried for so long as a private burden, now stood in the open, illuminated by fluorescent lights and confirmed by data that could not be argued with. It didn't matter what I believed anymore, or what I had intended. The lie could not survive contact with evidence. As I stood there, watching science dismantle years of silence with quiet efficiency, I understood that the moment I had feared all my life had arrived, not with shouting or accusations, but with numbers on a page and the steady insistence of reality. There was no space left for rationalization, no comfort in intention. The past had not just confronted me. It had overtaken me, and it was no longer mine to control. What remained was the aftermath, waiting patiently to be lived. The truth did not announce itself with a single sentence or a dramatic reveal. It surfaced in fragments, through careful conversations held behind closed doors, through medical professionals choosing their words with precision they could not soften enough. It moved from one room to another like a current, unseen but unmistakable, pulling everyone in its path whether they were ready or not. At first, there was disbelief, a refusal so instinctive it felt almost physical. Voices lowered, then rose. Questions were asked again and again, not because answers were unclear, but because repeating them felt like a way to slow their meaning. Records were produced, then examined as if they might change under scrutiny. Dates were circled. Names were traced with trembling fingers. Someone laughed once, sharply, the sound breaking off midair when no one joined in. I was asked to speak, not accused, not confronted, just asked to explain what I remembered, what I knew. Standing there, I felt strangely detached, as if the words coming from my mouth belonged to someone else, someone who had rehearsed them long ago and finally been given permission to say them out loud. I told the story the way it had always lived inside me, carefully without embellishment, stripped of intention and heavy with consequence. I admitted what I had seen. I admitted what I had suspected. I admitted what I had chosen not to do. The room did not erupt. It went quiet. The fracture began there, not with shouting, but with the sudden, irreversible awareness that something essential had shifted. Parents looked at children they had loved for decades and saw the same faces they always had, but now layered with questions that had no gentle answers. Children looked back with expressions I could not name, trying to reconcile memory with revelation. Love did not vanish, but it wavered, destabilized by the knowledge that it had grown in the shadow of a mistake. Some reacted with anger sharp enough to cut through the air. Others withdrew, retreating into silence that felt heavier than any accusation. There were tears, but not the kind that cleanse. These were the kind that come from loss without a clear object, grief without a funeral. Relationships splintered along invisible fault lines. Conversations ended abruptly, unfinished and impossible to resume. What had once felt solid now felt provisional, uncertain. I watched it all with a terrible clarity. This was what I had feared for so long, the unraveling. And yet, seeing it happen, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to before. The damage was not new. It had only been hidden. Silence had not preserved these families. It had suspended them in a version of reality that could not survive the truth. The days that followed blurred together, marked by meetings and phone calls, by legal discussions I struggled to follow, by moments of raw humanity that caught me off guard. I became a fixed point in the story, referenced, explained, blamed, forgiven in ways that never felt complete. Some people wanted nothing to do with me. Others surprised me with a quiet kindness I did not feel I deserved. Most hovered somewhere in between, unsure how to place me now that the lie I carried had been set down. When things finally slowed, when there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, I found myself alone with the weight of it all. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was ordinary, which made it harder to bear. Life continued. People went to work. Meals were eaten. Days passed. But everything felt altered, as though the world had shifted slightly off its axis and would never quite settle back into place. I thought often about time, about how much faith I had placed in it, how I had believed it could soften edges and bury mistakes. I understood now that time does neither. It amplifies. It deepens grooves, makes patterns harder to break. Silence, paired with time, becomes something else entirely. It gains authority. It begins to masquerade as truth. I replayed my choices endlessly, not to punish myself, but to understand them. I saw clearly how fear had disguised itself as compassion, how my desire to avoid immediate pain had created a far greater one. I had believed that by saying nothing, I was sparing others. In reality, I had been sparing myself, the discomfort of being the one to disrupt everything. Truth, when it finally arrived, did not heal the way I once imagined it might. It did not restore balance or offer closure, but it did something quieter and more honest. It ended the lie. It stopped time from adding weight to something already too heavy to carry. Now, when I think back to that night in the maternity ward, I no longer focus on the chaos or the exhaustion. I focus on the pause, the brief moment where everything could have changed. I understand now that silence is never neutral. It is a decision whether we acknowledge it or not, and it always chooses a side. I live with the consequences of that understanding. I always will. And if there is any meaning left to take from what remains, it is this. The truth does not wait forever, but when it comes, it asks for everything time was allowed to keep. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with yourself. If you had been standing where I stood, if you had known the truth, but telling it would destroy the only life a child had ever known, would you have spoken, or would you have stayed silent like I did? There's no right answer. That's why this story hurts. If this story made you pause, if it followed you longer than you expected, let me know. Comment where you're watching from, and tell me what you would have done. I read every comment, and I'd love to say hello just to know how far this story has traveled and who it reached. And if you want more stories like this, stories that ask the questions we usually avoid, subscribe.